We've talked about centralization with the breadfruit, and we've talked about publication with oxygen. Now let's talk about classification and encyclopedias. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine that you have to organize a series of topics, but you're not allowed to use the alphabet to organize them. How would you put together information about herbal remedies, King Arthur, the theory of atoms, Buddhism, Bethlehem, PA, and leopards? How would you organize if you're not allowed to use the alphabet? The 18th century is the time when encyclopedias and new forms of knowledge are taking off. In a previous lecture, I mentioned Isidore of Seville, a church father in the early Middle Ages. His T.O. world map was published in a kind of encyclopedia called the Etymology. There was such a hunger for encyclopedic knowledge that this encyclopedia was printed 10 times between 1470 and 1529. Well, how did people think about knowledge and its organization? They thought of knowledge as being organized into the trivium and the quadrivium, that is, the 3 and the 4. The 3 are the base of all learning: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. If you can think of these 3 as the skills of writing, public speaking, and analysis. The 4 are the next level of learning: music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. Together, these 7 were considered the liberal arts, and each was a different and essential field of knowledge. And here's a picturesque version. The liberal arts are shown as young women dressed in high medieval fashion. They are led by the metaphorical philosophy, who is bringing comfort and help to a philosopher named Boethus. He's off to the left, not visible. Well, who was Boethus? He was a real person, a philosopher and a bureaucrat who fell afoul of the Roman emperor. He wrote a very popular and influential book called On the Consolation of Philosophy while he was in prison, awaiting execution in 572. After his death, his book was read, copied, translated, and taught throughout the Middle Ages. This picture is a kind of medieval meme. Everybody knew what this scene represented. They knew who these ladies were, like you know who the Avengers are. This picture captures an understanding of the structural knowledge of education that everyone understood from the Middle Ages through to the Renaissance and up until the start of the 18th century. Take a closer look. The group is led by philosophy, wearing a rich blue gown with a large linen headdress. Next comes grammar, in a very plain dress with a book, and rhetoric likewise with a scroll. Logic carries a sieve to strain out arguments, and she has a fashionable high hat and a veil. Music next to her wears an open-sided blue overdress, trimmed with ermine fur, and carries a sheaf of music. Astronomy at the end also wears a fashionable high hat with a floating veil like logic does. She and music both have open-sided overdresses. Astronomy's is brown with the square armholes rather than the blue with rounded armholes. Astronomy carries an armillary sphere, which is a small handheld tool for displaying the rotation of the planets. Geometry is carrying a set square, and next to her, arithmetic has a fur hat and a sheet of symbols. Think about the structure of your own education. How would you fit the Northampton Community College required Gen Ed core into these 7 categories? We ask every AA and AS student to take 8 classes or 24 credits of Gen Eds. You must take 9 credits in communication, 3 in arts and humanities, 6 in social sciences, and 6 credits in math and sciences. That typically means 2 English classes, an introduction to communication class, psychology, sociology, statistics or algebra, and a science like biology, chemistry, physics, geology, or astronomy. Where do these classes fit in with the past ideas about these 7 essential areas for education? Do they match? What's missing? What's been added? The beginning of the 18th century saw the advent of a new kind of encyclopedia and a new arrangement of knowledge. The 7 lovely ladies were replaced. The writers, publishers, and financial backers of books now try to fit what they thought of as new branches of knowledge into the older systems. This is a picture of the Universal Dictionary of the Arts and Sciences, published in 1728 by Ephraim Chambers. He was apprenticed to a globe maker and then spent the rest of his life writing, organizing, and publishing this book. Look at religion. Where would you put it in relationship to the other branches of knowledge? You can find it by following along the natural branch, and then the rational branch, and then it is connected to relations and to happiness. It lies in the same area as geometry. I seriously doubt that anyone, even the most pious of thinkers, would construct a picture of knowledge this way now. But consider astronomy, which is lined up first as artificial or technical, and then external, and then real, and then about the quantities of bodies, called mixed mathematics. Again, I challenge anyone, the builders of the Webb telescope included, to reproduce this line of thinking now. It's bewildering but fascinating to look through older organizations of knowledge, and it's helpful to realize that the way we think about classifying knowledge has changed, and changed radically. This picture on the left is the taxonomy of all human knowledge by the French author and philosopher Denis Diderot. His massive Encyclopedias was published between 1751 and 1765. Its aim was to open up the fields of knowledge for everyone. He wanted to share and not lose craft secrets. Obviously, not everyone could get a copy of this book, but there were a lot more people who could read than in previous centuries, and there were many more private funders and financial backers of the printing of this book. The Encyclopedia published how to do things like making cloth with pictures. This central picture is wool carding, a part of the process of making yarn or thread. In 1772, Diderot added a picture, a frontispiece for the whole project, which describes the unveiling of knowledge. His description, translated, is as follows. Beneath an iconic temple, the sanctuary of truth, one sees truth enveloped in a veil and radiating light which parts the clouds and disperses them. To the right, reason and philosophy are busy, one in raising the veil from truth, the other in tearing it away. At her feet, theology, on her knees, receives the light from on high. In following this chain of figures, one finds them on the same side memory, ancient and modern history. History records the pomp and ceremony, and time serves as its support. Below them are grouped geometry, astronomy, and physics. The figures below this group represent optics, botany, chemistry, and agriculture. At the bottom are several arts and professions which derive from the sciences. At the left of truth, one sees imagination, who positions herself to adorn and crown truth. Below imagination, the artist has placed the different genres of poetry, epic, dramatic, satire, and pastoral. After that come the other arts of imitation, music, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Consider what I told you in the little bridge lecture about science and work. Once again, there's a gendered presentation of knowledge and science and knowing as female. And if you'd like to think about a parallel modern project in branding knowledge, consider the Wikipedia logo. There's a whole Wikipedia entry on how the logo was developed and what it means. But back to Diderot. The very big breakthrough in knowledge and organization came when the encyclopedia writers began to categorize knowledge alphabetically rather than schematically. The first was the Grand Dictionnaire Historique in 1674 by Louis Marreri. Although he provided a taxonomy of knowledge, Diderot's encyclopedia took this approach alphabetical as well. What this change does is allow flexible expansion according to a very simple system. If you know an arbitrary system of letters, you can find items or add new items of knowledge. You no longer have to consider how you are going to fit old knowledge into new knowledge. For more on the development of encyclopedias, really, the development of encyclopedias is fascinating. I've put a few links in the notes for you. As we come to the end of our lecture, let's pause to do some thinking for ourselves. Who decides what's true for you? Who decides what constitutes accurate information for you? What if it's just you, by yourself, deciding what's true? Who are the accepted authorities for historical accounts? What kind of information should get left out or counted out? Here are some questions to ask if it's just you deciding. First, is it possible to replicate? Can it be confirmed by a material source? Can it be confirmed by another written source? Is this narrator reliable about other information? Do I believe that this could ever have happened? Let's think about authorities. Who are the accepted authorities for historical accounts? There could be journals who have peer reviewers, or encyclopedias who have editorial boards. It could be bundles of information that are sold as reliable, like EBSCOhost or ProQuest. It could be organizations that have standing as being reliable. It could be individuals who have standing as being reliable. These are kinds of ways that we think of as authoritative information. Well, what kinds of information gets left out or counted out? It could be information that was supposed to be hidden or secret, conspiracies, events that are generally supposed to be miraculous, or knowledge that is craft-specific and not written down. Or it could be knowledge generated by people without standing as an accepted authority. These are some of the questions you might ask yourself. Who do you believe, and why do you believe it? Let's look ahead for a minute to Chapter 4. We're going to look at coffee houses. We'll talk about private spaces for doing scientists and how they become public spaces and publicly funded institutions. We'll look at journals and newspapers and letters that spread information. We already noted that private men, Boyle, Hooke, Wren, Newton, solicited Charles II as their patron. They chose Francis Bacon as the founder and became the Royal Society. That we have discussed. We've also noted that the source of funding directed to the outcome of experiments really was generated by private wealth, but also was added to public benefit. There were some practical versus theoretical knowledge that was pursued. And we look at the distinction between technicians and craftsmen versus intellectuals and owners and elites. And I noted for you Joseph Banks, who was the president of the Royal Society, who illustrates the importance of being a scientist and a politician and an ambassador and an administrator, and also an imperialist. We also will look at the age of classification using Carl Linnaeus, who was another center of information flow, and we'll notice that there is some racism and sexism in his classification. Finally, we'll look at some of the particular scientific careers of interest to us. We'll note the founding of the British Museum, and we'll cross again the experiment upon a bird in the air pump, which we looked at last time. We'll notice the lunar men, and we'll begin thinking about electricity. We'll remind ourselves that women were seen as not being able to understand science, but nevertheless, there were women publishing in the field of science. Scientists could be dangerous, challenging God. They could also be dangerous because they could invent life, and Frankenstein is one version of this idea. We're going to notice another big social change, the enclosure movement, which excluded the poor from the countryside, and we'll begin to notice machine-made landscapes like the beautiful bridge above.